A few of the ways that you may have been hurt in church. One is been excluded or divided into us versus them, and you're not part of the in crowd, or people have slighted you. That really wounds. In the family of Jesus, there shouldn't be divisions like that. The New Testament says that in the family of Jesus, the old divisions just don't matter. There's not, Paul says, Jew or Greek or male or female or slave or free. We are all part of the same family of Jesus on the same level. Well, that doesn't always play out in reality. Have you been hurt in church? Who hasn't? I'm Dr. Carol, and today we're talking about something that, well, a lot of church people don't like to talk about, but it's real, and that is church hurt. How do you deal with it? How do you decide whether to leave or not to leave, whether to stay or go? I remember that song, Should I Stay or Should I Go? It's a hard question for many people. And how do you recover? How do you get through church hurt? And what does the other side look like? I have had more conversations than ever recently, just in the last few weeks, with friends, with people I know who have experienced some real church hurt and are wrestling with these very questions. Now, a friend of mine and I were doing some joint teaching for a small group of church leaders a couple weeks ago, and he asked this small group of church leaders a question. He said, has anybody here not been hurt in church? If that's you, raise your hand. It's always real. I don't know that there is a person who has been a follower of Jesus for any period of time and has been part of church who has not experienced some measure of church hurt. But we can't ignore it, and we do need to talk about it. One way I think about this is not unlike our human earthly families. The church is supposed to be the family of Jesus, the family of God, and in every family, it's messy, and you get hurt. I bet every single person listening or watching right now, if you think about your earthly family, yeah, you've been hurt by parents, by your spouse if you're married, by siblings, children, extended, family is messy, and the family of God is messy too. Anytime there are human beings, it's going to be messy. But sometimes an earthly family becomes so toxic that you have to separate. There are times when somebody in the family becomes physically violent, or there's an ongoing dangerous addiction, or other forms of really bad toxicity, and you have to separate from your earthly family. Well, what does that look like in the family of God? Well, those are a few of the things that I want to unpack, and I do not promise that in this few minutes we'll be able to give all the answers. But I hope in addressing these things that you will have a bit of framework about how to ask these questions, how to think about them, and perhaps some next steps will just become clear to you about where you move next. A few of the ways that you may have been hurt in church. One is been excluded or divided into us versus them, and you're not part of the in crowd, or people have slighted you. That really wounds. In the family of Jesus, there shouldn't be divisions like that. The New Testament says that in the family of Jesus, the old divisions just don't matter. There's not, Paul says, Jew or Greek or male or female or slave or free. We are all part of the same family of Jesus on the same level. Well, that doesn't always play out in reality. And when it doesn't, the hurt can be very real. Sexism, racism can happen in the church, and a whole other slew of possible ways of dividing us versus them, and you being shut out. It's real. Another possibility is getting spiritual junk food. The coming to church and connecting with other believers should nourish you. Church is designed by Jesus to be a place where you get real nourishment, where you get fed and stretched, and where you can grow and ask questions and learn and exercise your gifts and connect with God in a deeper way through being part of His people. But often it's just spiritual junk food that you get. Superficial or just half-baked biblical platitudes that don't really address the stuff in your life, and you leave feeling more empty, feeling worse about knowing what to do next, and it's just not satisfying. It's like junk food. There may be a few moments of feel good, but it leaves you even more empty afterwards. Then you may have been hurt by religious spiritual abuse. Sadly, it is far too common where people have used their religious position or God talk to wound and destroy another. I have talked with a friend of mine just this week who has experienced spiritual abuse by 2 different pastors. She is on staff at a church. She has been devoting her life for years to the work of God in the local church, and has had 2 episodes of very hurtful spiritual abuse from those in leadership above her. Regardless of what variety of church hurt you've experienced, it's important that we acknowledge it, that this is real. Now, some of these varieties of hurt may be reasons to leave. They may not always be reasons to leave. And I want now to just unpack a couple bad reasons to leave that aren't mature and healthy, and then some possible, really legitimate, honest reasons to leave. And again, I think of this not unlike a family. Now, when it comes to the church, some unhealthy, immature reasons that you might get upset and want to leave. One is if you just feel slighted. If the pastor didn't acknowledge you as you wish, or some group kind of you felt excluded. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, but feeling slighted, God will usually ask you to grow up and learn some things, and maybe how you relate will need to change a little bit, but that's not a good reason to leave. Another poor reason to consider leaving is the production value. In larger churches today, they often have the resources to do an amazingly quality presentation at a service. Yeah, say on a Sunday morning, the quality of the music and the lights and maybe smoke and the stage, and I mean it is a high quality production. Now, not all churches do that equally, but if the production quality isn't up to what you like, that's really not a mature reason to leave. You should not be going to church for the production value. You can get a great production at any secular kind of venue. The reasons to come to church should include connecting with God and connecting with His people. And the production value doesn't play into the reasons that you should be there. So if the production value slips, or if you don't like the production value, not a mature reason to leave. Another reason that you might think about leaving is differing politics. Certainly in recent times, at least here in the United States and our Western culture, there has been deep political divides. That is not a reason to leave the church if that is by itself. Now that can become, that can get into other kinds of toxic behavior, but I'm right now just specifically talking about political differences. Among Jesus' disciples, there were people who had opposite political views. Matthew had been a tax collector, and he had been basically collaborating with the Romans. Simon was a zealot, and he would have just as easily pulled out a knife at night and killed Matthew before he met Jesus. Blankety blank to those collaborators with the Romans. So in opposite political viewpoints, both disciples of Jesus, he called them both, and they both became his disciples and carried the gospel to the then known world. In the early church, in the early decades after Jesus was here and went back to heaven, people of very different political persuasions were gathering together to worship Jesus. Now, not always perfectly at all, but different politics is not a reason by itself to leave your church. So those are some immature, unhealthy reasons to leave. Should I stay or should I go? What about some reasons where you might need to go? I believe there are some. One of those reasons to pray about seriously about going is if your church is teaching heresy. Now, there are certainly many branches in the Protestant church now, and I believe that's one of the things that God is not happy with, because that does have divisions. But there's the main thing of the gospel. If the church that you are a part of is teaching a different gospel, as Paul said, teaching heresy, then that may be a serious time to consider going. Another time to consider going is spiritual abuse. I briefly referenced this earlier, but I want to park here for a minute. When you are harmed in the name of God, the wounds are very deep. When that happens within your church fellowship, it may be that you will need to leave in order to find healing and restoration. And I'll talk a bit more about what that can look like here in a second. Spiritual abuse uses God's name to bring stealing, killing, and destroying to another. Stealing, killing, and destroying is never from God. It's the thief who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And when that kind of activity goes on in the name of God, God is seriously displeased. It happens in the Christian church. That may be that can be a variety of things. It may be using spiritual authority to exert sexual favors. Incredibly destructive. It may be something like micromanaging people's lives. Basically, toxicity in the name of God. If that is going on, especially if it's going on in an ongoing basis, you're going to have to leave. A third real serious reason to consider leaving is gross misuse of power, dangerous leadership. When Christian leaders take that power and glory to themselves that only should belong to God, ostentatious displays of wealth or power, and use that power not in the service of others, but basically to feed their own egos, that becomes dangerous. It's ungodly, and I don't believe God is pleased. And that may be a very serious reason you need to leave. Now, if you do need to leave, that doesn't mean it's the end. It does mean that you will need some time. A couple words about what the process needs to be for you after you leave. Or if you are staying but need to recover from some significant church hurt. It may or may not be leaving your local church body. There are times when the church hurt is not necessarily ongoing or dangerous, but the wounds are there and you still need to find some healing. There are times when the church hurt is ongoing and damaging and you have to. So regardless, what does the process of healing after that look like? One important piece is your picture of God. A.W. Tozer said that there is nothing, the most important thing about us is what we think in our minds when we think of God. The most important thing about us is what comes into our mind when we think of God. If God has become a bad word for you, if the idea or thought of God brings pain, you probably will need to find a new God. Now, by that I mean you aren't going out to just choosing whatever God you want. God is who He is. But your mental perception of who He is and your emotional perception of who He is may need to radically change. When people, especially church leaders, wound and harm others in the name of God, that damaging abuse becomes so mixed up with your internal reality of God that it can be challenging to disentangle that. I'm working with a couple clients right now where that is what their process is having to be. They're having to disentangle God and who He is from the harm that they experienced from Christian leaders in God's name. We know from psychological studies that your picture of God, your internal feelings about Him, have an impact on your mental, emotional well-being. There are some large studies out of Baylor a little while ago that showed if you internally perceive or feel that God is some variety of out to get you, He's wanting to punish you, He's controlling and manipulative and harsh and unjust, that you will have a lot more psychological psychiatric symptoms. On the other hand, someone who experiences and perceives God to be someone who is for you, He is good, and He is with you, there will be a much better emotional, psychological well-being and a lot fewer negative psychiatric symptoms. We certainly know from Scripture that what you know and believe and feel about God makes a huge difference for your well-being in all kinds of ways. We have science to support that additionally today. But I'd encourage you to ask yourself, what do you feel about God? Not only what you think about Him, but what does your internal system perceive Him to be? How close is He or far away from you is He? How does He feel about you? And it's much more important to go beyond just, for example, scriptural bylines, as important as that is. But this is a moment of paying attention to your internal world and who you are experiencing God to be. Now, it's next important to remember that that may or may not be the reality of who God is. It's probably worth giving yourself permission to consider that God may be different than you feel He is, and that there may be a different way to experience God. He may be different than you feel Him to be, and just consider that as a possibility. In the process of finding a new God, it's really the process of coming to know who God really is. And we come to know that by undoing old brain pathways. We come to perceive things about another, including perceive things about God, in a number of ways. Certainly, the statements that we hear about someone invisible such as God make a difference. And that you read in the Bible and you learn in church and other kinds of Christian teaching. You learn about God through logical, what we call left brain truths. And that's real. We also learn about another such as God through our right brain perceptions, our experience. And one of the most dramatic ways of changing your brain pathways is to feel felt by another. If you are not feeling felt by God, there's some area of growth for you, because there is no one who gets you better than God does. If your internal world struggles to believe that, just know that God is patient, and this is in no way saying something bad about you, but it's an opportunity to explore more. There are 3 important pieces of recovering after church hurt. And I'll leave you with these 3 important pieces. One is time. It takes time to recover from serious wounds, whether they're physical or emotional or spiritual. So giving yourself time will be important. Now, that doesn't mean indefinite time, but there is at least a partial sense in which you can't speed up healing. There does have to be a process of time that goes past. And again, know that God is patient. It will take time. What you do during that time does make a difference in how well, and in some ways how quickly, you do experience healing and recovery after serious church hurt or spiritual abuse. And that's what the other 2 things are that you need. One of those is solitude. You need time alone. You need time to feel the feelings, to unpack the experience of the hurt, and unpack how does that relate to your perception of God. I believe journaling can be a powerful part of walking through that recovery in solitude. And then when you're ready, in solitude, approaching God, asking Him to interpret your experience for you. That can be challenging if you've been hurt in the name of God, but He does invite you to do that. Again, not a rush, but at some point that will be a very, very helpful part of your journey to recovery and healing. And then the other thing that you need is a few people. You need a few other warm bodies, followers of Jesus, to hear you, to hold the Christ light for you. As one of the old songs said, the servant song is one I was so ministered to some years ago when I needed some healing. And one phrase in that song is, I will hold the Christ light for you in the nighttime of your fear. We need people to hold the Christ light for us when we are that wounded. And you need a few people to do that. Let me also encourage you that if you know someone who is experiencing this kind of just deep heart wounds when it comes to church and God and so on, you be the one to hold the Christ light for them, not to fix them, to be there, the ministry of presence. Now, if you are the person who's needing to recover from church hurt, I would encourage you to just think about the people who you are aware of, your acquaintances, perhaps friends. It may be that many of your friends are in the church that you've had to step back from, and that can be an incredible part of having to decide to leave. But regardless, think about, and if you are able to pray about who are the 2, 3, 4 people that you might be able to connect with. And then just one by one, or if there's a couple, with a couple, just you might approach them, either call them or meet for coffee or something like that and say, I'm really struggling with some things in my own heart about, church and God and all of that. And I'm wondering maybe you're somebody I could talk to about that. And then if they say yes, share just a little bit and see how they respond. If they judge you and condemn you and push you away, that's not one of your people. If they try and fix you and give you all kinds of advice, that's not one of your people. What you're looking for is a few people who listen, who can hear you, who you can feel felt by. And it's going to take some time. You're going to need some conversations with a few Jesus followers who can hold the Christ light for you. So again, those three things that are critical ingredients in recovery from significant, serious church hurt, spiritual abuse. One is time, one is solitude, and the other is people, a few other Christ followers. You may need a spiritual director or a Christian counselor. That can be very valuable. It's one of the things I am privileged to do in my coaching with individuals who are walking through some of these really difficult things. And you'll see the link to that under this video or in the show notes to this podcast if that's something you want to check out and find out more about. So if you have been hurt in church, that doesn't mean you stay where you are being abused, but neither does it mean you turn your back on God and church. It means there will be a process that you can go through and experience healing and peace again. I know that the journey can seem difficult, but I want to encourage you that it's possible, and I would love to hear from you if you would like some encouragement in that journey. Now, in the show notes or under this video, I have also linked to a few articles where I talk about some of these things more. I write to someone who has been hurt in church. I unpack more about the things that you need to recover from church hurt. How do you connect again after, if you have felt like you've had to pull away from church, how do you connect again? So check out those articles as well. You'll find the links under this video or in the show notes. And I pray that you do experience peace and healing. I love to hear from you. If you reach out, know that it will be confidential, and I will get back to you personally. Use the contact page, you'll find that link. And if you leave a message on the contact page, it comes just to me and I will respond. And until next time, may God bless you.